All right, so the Lakers have a new head coach. I wanted to take a couple of minutes tonight to break down why I think Darvin Ham is such a good hire, talk a little bit about the Lakers front office and what's next for them, as well as just what I expect moving forward as they're rounding out the rest of the coaching staff. So, they narrowed it down to Terry Stotts and Kenny Atkinson and Darvin Ham. There were some rumors out there about Doc Rivers. We'll get to those in just a few minutes. The Kenny Atkinson and Terry Stotts examples, I didn't think they were bad options necessarily. I think both of them have a little bit more experience in terms of offensive organization as head coaches, and they've demonstrated in their personal experience better offensive organization. And I do think offensive organization is vitally important to this Lakers team to a certain extent, but I think there's something far more important to this Lakers team, and that's restoring their identity that they built in the 2020 season, which was as a defensive team. And as you're seeing routinely in this playoff run, it is the teams that hang their hat on the defensive end that end up having the most success, especially as you get later into the postseason. So first of all, schematically, I think it's a seamless transition for Darvin Ham with what he brings over from Milwaukee to the Lakers. The Bucks ran a twin rim protector system. They used Giannis and Brook Lopez at the same time, typically Giannis navigating the screen and roll coverage because he's more mobile, and Brook Lopez on the back line as a rim protector. But there was some interchangeability there, although Brook wasn't as good in his drop coverage as Giannis was. As you can see, Giannis is capable of some things in drop coverage that are, no other NBA player can do, like his block that he had on DeAndre Ayton in the NBA Finals last year. But what I like about that coverage is I think it's a good example of a coverage that can help the Lakers eat innings in the regular season. I prefer switching defenses. I've laid this out in detail on the show. I think it baits teams into isolation basketball. I think it's easier on teams physically because they don't have to fight through screens as often. It takes the strain of defense off of the physical elements and puts it on your brain. As long as you're focused and paying attention and you're communicating with your teammates, you can run a successful switching scheme without having to battle through a ton of physicality, right? But a couple of things. First of all, teams don't like to switch too much in the regular season because those physical mismatches lead to wear and tear. Also, it requires a certain type of personnel. You can't run a successful switching scheme unless you have at least 3 or 4 really solid perimeter defenders on the team. You can do what you've seen Miami and Golden State do, where you have your weaker defenders do hedges and basically do a hedge and recover to avoid a switch, but you can't do that when everyone on the floor is a defensive liability. You need a certain amount of overall defensive talent on the roster in order to make that work. A lot is up in the air in that department for the Lakers. We don't know what they're going to be able to accomplish this offseason. They don't have a ton of options. So much comes down to what they can get back for Russ. So much comes down to what they can find in the veteran minimum market, changing their priorities from the types of players that they targeted last offseason, which obviously did not pan out. I hope that they can target enough bigger, stronger perimeter players that defend well that they can do more switching, but chances are that they won't be able to do that as much, and they'll have to be a team like Milwaukee that relies heavily on drop coverage as they go into the postseason. So because of that, I like the idea of taking Darvin Ham's twin rim protector scheme that he helped run with Milwaukee and bringing that into LeBron James and Anthony Davis. Plus, LeBron James and Anthony Davis, for all of their issues with being engaged and caring on the defensive end, when they care, they're actually a better defensive duo than Brook Lopez and Giannis. So you could see a version of that working extremely well. So I love the schematic transition coming from Milwaukee to LA for Darvin. But that buy-in, that trying on defense part that I just hinted at is the second big element here, and arguably the most important. For everything that we can talk about with the Lakers over the course of the last 2 seasons, there were 2 consistent issues. One, LeBron James and Anthony Davis weren't on the floor together enough. Over the course of the last 2 seasons, it just was an incessant line of injury to one guy or the other. It was incredibly discouraging, and it never seemed like they could get a consistent stretch of games where the 2 guys were playing. But then last season, Anthony Davis had a bad defensive season by his standards in terms of his overall engagement. And then this last season, LeBron James and Anthony Davis had bad defensive seasons by their personal standards. And I think a lot of that has to do with just their egos and them having a hard time buying into these established kind of traditional types of coaches, these guys that have been around the league for a long time, the guys that aren't former players, that don't really resonate with them when they're trying to look at them in the face and be like, hey man, I need you to play some defense. I saw LeBron James tune out Frank Vogel. I saw Anthony Davis tune out Frank Vogel. I saw LeBron James tune out David Blatt back in 2016. It's been a pretty consistent theme for those guys. But I don't think it's a coincidence that you're seeing a lot of former players, guys like Jason Kidd, guys like Ty Lue, guys like Ime Udoka, guys that were not just former NBA players, but former NBA players that played relatively recently in the league in a way that they can, have some common ground with these players, and also players that had a persona that was tough. Players that the impact that they had on the locker room as players was infectious toughness. I think that specific archetype of coach is having a lot of success these days, resonating with some of the egotistical players around the league. Like I said before, you guys have seen Boston under Ime Udoka go from a team that was notoriously soft to a team that was remarkably tough and has won some huge playoff games with their back against the wall in this playoff run, right? You've seen Ty Lue and all the success he's had with the Clippers. You saw Jason Kidd finally get the Dallas Mavericks to play defense. Luka Doncic, for all of his issues on defense, had a better season on that end than he's had in years past. That's the example of a tough former player having an impact on big egos in the locker room and getting them to commit to that end of the floor. So I love the example that Darvin Ham kind of fits into in the way that I believe he will resonate with LeBron James and Anthony Davis, getting them not just on the floor, which is out of his control, but dialed in and bought in when they are on the floor, which is arguably the most important detail. And last but not least tonight, I've been incredibly critical of the Lakers front office and ownership group over the course of the last couple of years. And for good reason. I don't need to get into the details again, but they have burnt so many bridges for me as someone who covered the franchise over the course of the last couple of years. I don't trust them at all. And all that criticism that I levied on them, I believe was fair. And criticism is an important part of this job, but I also believe fairness is an important part of this job. If I'm going to be critical of you, it's incumbent on me to also call out your successes. I don't agree with everything they did during this coaching search. I didn't believe it was necessary to continue to consult with, coaches and personalities that aren't involved in the NBA anymore, guys like Magic Johnson, guys like Phil Jackson. I disagreed with that approach personally. But in terms of the candidates they interviewed, the things that they prioritized, I loved their list of finalists, and then they picked the guy that I liked the most, the guy that I thought was best equipped for this job. So, for a team that, and an ownership group and a front office that has had a pretty ugly history, I got to tip the cap to them this time. They did what I believe was a very procedural, smart, patient, and properly motivated coaching search. So hats off to them. But this is the thing. As is always the case, the best indicator of future performance is past performance. And I'm worried about the future steps after this point. Now we have to round out the coaching staff with qualified candidates that complement Darvin Ham's persona, right? It'd be great to have a guy who's a specialist in offensive organization, spacing concepts, things that I believe are vitally important in the playoff run. And then they have to round out the roster. You've got to give Darvin Ham the tools necessary to succeed. One of the things that I'm personally worried about for Darvin Ham is that this team is so poorly run that he's going to end up being the next scapegoat for issues that are brought on by Rob Pelinka and Jeannie Buss. I sincerely hope that's not the case. This is the first step in the right direction. They've got a lot more to do. But I'm very excited for Darvin Ham. This is the first step in restoring the Lakers to where they were in 2020.